I know myself well enough that sitting quietly on a mountaintop for 30 minutes and focusing on my breathing doesn't work. But get me in a pool where I'm focused on the aerodynamics of the water going across my body, on counting my breaths, that sort of thing, being present, that's a great way of meditating for me. So it all gets back to this concept of focus and being present.
This is Task, Time, Energy, the Purpose-Filled Productivity Podcast. I'm your host, Scott Miller. Welcome to the show. Welcome, everyone. Today's guest, Jon Kolkin, is an internationally recognized artist, physician, educator, speaker, and humanitarian. Jon has been practicing medicine for over 30 years. He has been an international medical volunteer for 20 years and also helped found a medical center. As a speaker, Jon has given in-person presentations in over 11 countries. Jon is a very accomplished photographer. His recent book of photography, titled Inner Harmony, Living in Balance, includes forewords by the Dalai Lama and the Queen Mother of Bhutan. This book received the International Photography Awards Silver Medal for documentary books by a professional photographer. It received a gold medal at the Tokyo International Photo Awards and a gold medal at the Prix de la Photographie Internationale in Paris. Jon is also involved in numerous humanitarian efforts, including the ongoing Shades of Compassion International Traveling Museum exhibition, which includes pieces from Jon's Inner Harmony series. And these are exhibited alongside works by Ansel Adams, Imogen Cunningham, Joyce Tennyson, and other distinguished photographers. Looking at Jon's biography and resume, there's just so much there, so many interesting experiences and accomplishments. We could certainly spend several more minutes talking about what Jon's accomplished. But I'd just like to pause here and say welcome, Jon, and ask if you have anything you'd like to add, any recent accomplishments or anything that you think our listeners would enjoy hearing about.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to be here. And as you said, we could go on in a variety of different directions about some of my background as a musician and whatnot. But I think I'll pretty much leave it at that. That was a very nice introduction, and I'm happy to dive into our conversation.
Yeah, excellent. It's interesting to talk to people who have accomplished a lot, who are doing a lot with their time, and also have a really diverse set of experiences. You know, some of your bios reading about you online, they often talk about how you're deeply rooted in both the scientific world as a physician and in the artistic world as an artist, musician, photographer. We were talking a bit earlier about the idea of finding balance in life and how compassion and core values play such an important role in that. It would be great for you to share your thoughts about that.
Sure, I'd be happy to. An excellent way to start our conversation. There's a tendency for me and for all of us as we go through life to make the assumption that we have to fit in to a certain category. And what I've found is that it's been very valuable for me not to get sucked into that, not to want to even be identified by, let's say, my profession. And one would have to define what you mean by profession. I wear a variety of different hats. I think for all of us, there's this pie, and there are different pieces of the pie that make us whole. And that's not just a profession that we might pursue, but it's also how we are as a member of a family, let's say, how we view our place in the world, how we interact with others. So as an example, maybe I stumbled upon this, but when I was, let's say, in high school, Sure, I was on the track team. I was the captain of the track team, won all kinds of awards, great. But I never really looked at myself as a jock. In the same way, I was a musician. I was selected to be a member, as an example, of the American Youth Symphony. We did a 10-country European concert tour, but I never necessarily considered myself in that crowd. Or I was reasonably good in academics, but I never looked at myself as a nerd group, so to speak. So, in fact, I think that really has helped along the way. And by recognizing that one of my core values is just to be authentic about who I am and not to be put on any airs, has really served me well over the years. So when one knows what their 2 or 3 core values are, it really helps in both the career decisions, career goals. It helps in, let's say, 1-year plans. It helps in deciding what I'm going to focus on and on a particular day. It helps on the micro level of, we all have thousands of decisions, whether we know it or not, that we make on a daily basis. And if we know what our guiding principles are, it's much easier to sift through all that and decide, for me anyway, where I might want to focus my time and energy. And some of the benefits of that, maybe I've stumbled upon them over time, but as an example, getting into medical school, it was during the Vietnam War and everyone was trying to get a draft deferment. And so there was a lot of competition. And when I went off to college, I knew I couldn't play my clarinet the way I had previously, and decided instead to focus on voice, which was a new challenge for me. The music teacher ended up going to bat for me to at least get me an interview at the medical school where I ended up going. And that interview involved 6 candidates lining up on one side of a table and 6 professors on the other side of the table. And we knew that 2 of us would end up, on average, getting an invitation to the school. All the other people, when asked the question about who was someone they admired in life, were talking about some obscure scientist here, there, or otherwise. And I started talking about Johann Sebastian Bach and his variations on the theme and a variety of different ways of looking at things. And I am convinced that that was one of the things that helped me get into medical school. And in a similar light, when I went for interviews for my residency, when the chairman of the department where I ended up going sat me down in his office, which was low lights and wood paneling. And when he opened up the portfolio and saw that I had an background in music, he threw the portfolio down on this table, turned the lights down low, turned on the classical music, and we talked about classical music the entire time. So that's just one example of how, and there are many other examples I can give you about just trying to be authentic about who I was and not being pigeonholed and not being stamped on my forehead physician has helped me, I think, along this somewhat unusual path.
That's an excellent story, a couple of excellent stories there. And actually, I have a couple of questions, just reflecting on what you said. You mentioned the idea of, how easy it is to define ourselves based on some category, like being a jock, being a brain, being a whatever that is. It seems like, there's such a tendency to do that, maybe because it gives us some sense of certainty. Is why we gravitate towards those somewhat artificially defined roles in life. And it's interesting what you're saying about how you've been willing to just be authentic and be yourself, going into what was probably a very high pressure, high stakes interview to get into medical school, and just being willing to genuinely talk about, your interest in music. That led to success. Is that something that you feel came naturally to you, or is that like something that you feel like you cultivated?
I was very fortunate, I think, in that I stumbled upon a lot of this. It was instinctive. When I would see people that were trying to push themselves on others, you could sense, just my instinct would sense that lack of depth, that lack of richness. And I tend to gravitate toward people that are just being themselves. I mean, when I'm around His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, I've had the good fortune of having private meetings with him on 4 occasions. He doesn't take himself too seriously. He puts the ego aside. He's just humble. He's just himself. And he said this multiple times. He's just a monk in a robe. And if the Dalai Lama can be that way, certainly I can. Don't take yourself too seriously. I mean, enjoy life. People are so unhappy frequently in their job or whatever. And it's because, not always it's because, but part of it is just feeling they have to fit this mold. And I find as a photographer, as an artist, that exact same thing holds true. And people are welcome to go to my website, kolkinphotography.com. And I've been told, and I just lucked upon it, that my work is different. It's just unique. And it's partly because I did not have all the formal training in photography. I'm not well schooled in reading about other photographers. I've just done what comes naturally and have been astounded at the kind of response that my work has gotten around the world. So it's that freshness or that uniqueness, I've been told anyway, about my photography that has been good for me. I would also say in medicine, it's the same thing. In medicine, if you just regurgitate what you've been told in medical school and consider that, the authority, then you're going to be lost because you're not really open to really being present, seeing what's really going on, observing how patients are responding, putting my ego aside that, no, I don't have all the answers, and just really absorb what they have to offer. And that's the only way I can grow as a physician. So again, not taking myself too seriously that I have to have all the answers or that I'm any great this or that. I've got plenty of weaknesses. And I recognize as many of those as I can. As an example, I'm dyslexic. I hate to read and write. I know that about myself. So I get help in the areas that I'm not good at. I'm horrible in languages. So even though I've done humanitarian work around the globe for 20 years, I make sure that I have interpreters that really know good English, that have a command of the medical terminology, and use other modes of communication besides just vocal in communicating different ideas. So I think it's important for all of us to recognize our weaknesses and put our ego aside and have some humility and really just soak it in.
It's interesting to hear you talk about being dyslexic and not being so great with languages because, yeah, clearly it's you have the humility about it and the humility that leads to being willing to ask for help. And also, it sounds like you have a bit of a sense of humor about it. You're willing to just, hey, this is how it is. And it seems like people very often, maybe this is something we learn along the way in life, but people are very ashamed of their weaknesses or not willing to admit that they have them, which just means you're not doing anything about it. I mean, how would you successfully or even be able to enjoy traveling internationally and doing the kind of humanitarian work that you've been doing if you're not willing to say, hey, I'm not so great with language and it really helped me to have an interpreter and a skilled interpreter who can help with these specific things? Yeah.
It's an asset. Being dyslexic is an asset. That's the way I look at it, because it makes one need to accommodate be creative in ways of navigating in a functional way, adds this extra layer of humility, hopefully. And that's right off the bat. As a young boy, I remember going through elementary school, I got straight C's. I never got even anything higher than a C all through elementary school. And it put me in my place, I think, and it was good. It was good because then when I got into junior high school, sure, my A's were in gym and were in music, maybe math, but, at least I got an A here or there, and it made me appreciate those A's a little bit more.
Yeah. Yeah. I can see how that appreciation would be there for sure. Even just in the past few weeks that we've been talking a little bit, planning this to record this podcast, it sounds like you have a very active life. You're very frequently traveling, and often we've had a meeting and you're saying you're leaving someplace tomorrow or coming back from someplace. It sounds like when you were younger, you clearly did well enough academically to get into college and then medical school. You said you're a musician, you were an athlete. Were you always the kind of person who liked to be busy, who liked having a lot of things on your schedule, just always liked to be on the go? Is that the way you've always been?
I think I've tried to really balance it. In other words, if I have an underlying value and or purpose for doing something, it makes it easier to carve out time for it. So as an example, even though I may be traveling, I'm also strategically planning for how, when, and where I can get some exercise, because physical and emotional health is important to me, for myself and for others. So I have to balance those things. So that's a priority. That's a priority. In order to be able to do those things, it's important for me to prioritize. So I'll start each day with, these are the 2 or 3 main priorities for this day, and be able to reasonably focus on those and not try to overpromise and underdeliver to myself. I want to set myself up for success, not for failure. So I have no main expectations for that day. I try to be realistic because things can change. Certain things can happen, and I'll have to change my priorities for that day. But I do try to maintain a reasonable amount of focus. And learning how to focus, I think, is helpful in this whole navigation on a daily basis for being productive. That being said, part of my being healthy is to have downtime. That doesn't mean on social media for hours on end, but that means at about 8:30, I start shutting down the brain. I'll get on what I call the boob tube, and I'll watch something like Shark Tank. That might be something that's interesting. I can learn a little bit of something, or America's Got Talent, or The Voice, since I'm, into music, or, just things like that. But I don't get on the boob tube watching violence and getting sucked into the news cycle and all that sort of thing, because it's not good for my health to be immersed or bombarded by all that violence and negativity and all that sort of thing. So I think those are things that are very helpful, and particularly being focused.
There are certain topics that seem to come up again and again in these conversations. A couple of the things that you said are very similar to things I've heard from other people. And it's enjoyed having some people, even recently on the podcast, who've just accomplished so much in their life by many different measures. You would say, wow, this person has just amazing accomplishments, or this is a person who gets more done in a week than a lot of people get done in a month. And something that comes up again and again when speaking with those people, and not even with me like prompting them, but they just bring up these ideas of, rather than asking, how do I get everything done? People seem to ask, what's important and how do I get those important things done? And also the idea of valuing downtime, not saying, time to relax, that's just an option. I don't really have the option to do that, but saying, no, time spent relaxing, downtime, time spent recharging is important and crucial to success. And I'm going to value it. I'm not going to spend it doing something that's not really enjoyable. I'm going to genuinely find those things that I enjoy, so that when I'm spending that hour watching TV, it's something that I'm going to enjoy. Those seem to be very common trends among people who, most of us mere mortals will look at and say, wow, how do they get all that done? Another thing that you said, though, that I think is really crucial, and I think is a very interesting topic to discuss, is values, and how core values really drive a lot of your decision making. What are some of the values that are really the essential ones, the core ones for you, and how do they help you make decisions about how to use your time?
Yeah, well, I think that in some ways this kind of almost segues into the international work that I did for 20 years. So physical and emotional health for me and for those that I can connect with or touch is really important to me. And also having quality relationships, not superficial. So one example that's not multitasking, but is finding synergies, are some of the experiences that I've had with my overseas work through health volunteers overseas. It's in an organization that's not like Doctors Without Borders that goes into unstable environments. It goes into countries that have a stable government, where there's a medical infrastructure, and where there's a brain trust or a teaching environment at an institution. And with the organization, one physician at a time goes and is embedded into their healthcare system, working with and exchanging ideas with those that are there. First of all, I'm not there to teach them wrong term. I'm there to exchange ideas, because what works, in my view, maybe in the United States, may be totally inappropriate in their environment. By doing that, it's the concept of give them a pole and teach them to fish. So I'm able to disseminate certain health-related concepts throughout the country by working specifically with that kind of a group. It's also very different than a team going over somewhere and trying to do a bunch of surgery, which stresses the resources of that location and is often very ineffectual. Along with that, the countries that I have gone to are safe for family members to go. So what I've done on some of the occasions is a one-on-one with either my wife going with me or one of my daughters going with me. One of my daughters, this was when she was like 13, 14 years old and very impressionable, loved going into the operating room. So being around all that was great for her. And she interacted with the medical students and helped teach English and whatnot. My other daughter, at the same age, can't stand the sight of blood, but is a world-class dancer. So what she did was she went, as an example, to an orphanage for deaf children in Vietnam and taught dance using the vibrations of the music. So this is not multitasking. We were in an area where they're getting their lives enriched. I'm also doing the medical work. It's another culture, so there's a respect for other ways of looking at things. By the way, they both wrote their college essays about their experiences with their father in these locations. Also, a lot of the places I go, like I spend a lot of time in the Himalayas, particularly in Bhutan, and I'm hiking in the mountains. That's physical health. So I'm accomplishing multiple things by strategizing and choosing which organization I'm going to work with, but I'm not multitasking.
It sounds like you have, I want to say, a concern or a skepticism about the idea of multitasking. Is that accurate?
It gets right back to the concept of focus. If I'm going to eat healthy, I have to focus on the food that I'm eating. I mean, it's just the reality. And I can go into all the medical reasons why it's important to eat slowly and focus on the food and chew the food, as opposed to gulping it down, and the time of day that we eat and all that sort of thing. It has to be done with intention. It's not a matter of being type A plus personality and obsessing over the food, but it's a matter of being focused on the food. And one gets much more out of that experience by doing that. And the practice of focusing on the food then helps us in focusing on other things that we may do at another time during the day. One of my favorite forms of, quote, meditation is swimming laps in a pool. Because for me, I know myself well enough that sitting quietly on a mountaintop for 30 minutes and focusing on my breathing doesn't work. But get me in a pool where I'm focused on the aerodynamics of the water going across my body, on counting my breaths, that sort of thing, being present, that's a great way of meditating for me. So it all gets back to this concept of focus and being present.
That seems to be, again, another common thread in this podcast, because there are times where people will come on and start talking about multitasking, and I'll ask them a little bit more in detail about, what do they consider multitasking? And very often it's grouping activities that naturally go together. Just like you talked about swimming, which someone might say, oh, that's exercise. And yet it's also very naturally dovetails and connects with, your meditation practice, your personal view of meditation. Another friend of mine who's a physician assistant, she has a very, very active life. She's raising 3 children and a mom and, a very active career in healthcare. She talks about things like, if she's going to go upstairs, if she has to go upstairs anyway, she's going to grab some laundry that needs to go upstairs. So that's like her idea of multitasking, things that naturally go together. Really, when people talk about effective multitasking, they seem to be talking about grouping tasks together that go together naturally, rather than what people often think of multitasking is, I'm going to be in a meeting, in a Zoom meeting with 10 colleagues where I'm supposed to be participating in the conversation or at least paying attention. But while somebody else is talking, I'm going to be writing an email, where we're not focusing. Our attention is split. And so it seems like multitasking, if we're going to attempt it at all, needs to be thought of very carefully. We need to be very careful about what actual multitasking is, what we mean by it, and whether or not we can actually do it effectively.
I really try to avoid even considering the things that I do multitasking and look at them more, as I like the term, synergies. And also, one of the reasons that I do that is that the whole idea of meditation is to focus on the present. Clearly, our minds wander. It happens all the time. It's natural. But we know from scientific studies of the anatomy of the brain that whatever we do on a repetitive basis causes structural changes in our brain that then become the new superhighway neural pathways. So whatever it is that we're training ourselves to do, that becomes the norm for us. So the reason I bring that up is the concept of multitasking can be dangerous to our neuroconnectivities in our brain, because it takes something that should not be so natural and makes it the norm. And again, without getting into all the anatomy and the physiology and axons and myelination and all that sort of thing, we have to be very, very careful of that. So I think it's important first to practice on the focus. And once someone does that intentionally, then there might be opportunities to use that practice in real time throughout our days. But if we don't initially practice on how to focus, then that becomes more difficult. And it doesn't have to be 30 minutes of meditating every day. There are what I call mini meditations that can also be helpful. Something as simple as when walking down the street or throughout your day, smile to 3 strangers making eye contact. At first, it'll seem forced, but after time, it will become what I call first nature, not second nature. The first bite of food for each meal, focusing on where did it come from, what was involved with getting it onto my plate, what had to happen, the rain, everything. Then what does it look like? What's its color? What's it going to feel like against my tongue? What's the texture going to be like when I bite into it? What's the taste going to be like? And then put that little pea or whatever into my mouth, appreciate it, gratitude for it, and then go through that process and visualize it going down my throat. That's 30 seconds. But if one does that 3 times a day, if one does 3 main meals, or even more, smaller meals, then that becomes first nature. So practicing that first, I think, is really important, intentionally doing that. And then one can maybe get to these other steps that, some of your interviewees call multitasking, what I call synergies.
I think it's refreshing to hear. One of the things you're with what you were just saying about looking for small opportunities throughout the day to practice mindfulness, to practice being completely focused on the present moment. I had very grateful to have the chance to study at a Tibetan Buddhist meditation center for a while. And, the resident teacher there is a Tibetan monk. He was recently on the podcast, Geshe Gelik. And there is a over 2,000-year tradition of study and meditation and many, many different types of meditation for different reasons. And one of the most basic ones that they teach us is just to sit and focus on your breath. And the purpose of that is to train your mind to focus on just one single thing when you want to, just focus on that one single thing. They'll often talk about just how powerful that is and how useful that is. And if, like you were saying, sitting on a cushion for 30 minutes or 10 minutes isn't necessarily your thing, there's so many opportunities throughout the day to practice just what are you doing right now? And can you focus your entire attention on that one thing, where you are and what you're doing and being present in that moment? I also think it's very refreshing in a world where maybe we feel pressure or perceive pressure to multitask, to hear from someone like you. And again, we've just scratched the surface on your resume and your accomplishments. I mean, you've had a successful career as a physician, a successful career as an artist, as a speaker, so much international humanitarian work, so much travel. To hear you say that for you, multitasking is not appealing at all, and sounds like you're saying your success comes from your ability, or at least something that's contributed to it, is your ability to just do one thing at a time and focus on one thing at a time. And if there is any overlap, it's that synergy that you were talking about, that kind of fundamental connection. I think that's really helpful for people to hear.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I'll just give you one other little example of this focusing on the present. As a physician, one typically has an office full of patients, all in separate examination rooms with the door closed for privacy before one walks in. What I typically would do would be to pick up the chart of the patient. And it doesn't matter what I was doing right before that, or what kind of situation the previous patient might have had, or what sort of distraction one of the people in the office might bring toward me because of something unexpected happening. Once I'm ready to walk into that patient's room, again, it doesn't matter what went on before, I've got to be focused on that patient. So one of the things I did would be to put my hand on the doorknob before opening the door and just feel the doorknob for 2 seconds. Why am I here? Take a breath and then walk in. Takes 2 seconds to do that. And if you're doing that 40 times well, more than 40 times a day, because you go into a patient's room, then you order an x-ray, then you go out, then you go back in again. So, it's just neuroplasticity all day long. When one is doing surgery, one has to be focused, laser focused. And if one's not, and I could get into all those kinds of scenarios, if one's not, then again, it's a disservice to what I'm supposed to be doing and what my supposed values are.
That's a wonderful example in a couple of ways, because, of course, we go to see the doctor and the doctor comes in and talks to us, and we may not realize you're dealing with so many different situations, so many different patients. You're dealing with patients who are in very difficult situations or dealing with serious illnesses. And yet, as you go from one appointment to the next, from one room to the next, of course, you're going to want to give that next patient your complete attention and be totally present for that person. So having that one technique you talked about, touching the doorknob, and using that as a practice to reset your focus. Often as a coach, it's something I talk to people about, are rituals and habits, which I think are related, but maybe there's a little difference there. But routines that become natural for us, that actually serve us really well for specific reasons. It sounds like that was a very useful one.
A lot of these things for years, I really didn't talk about what I was doing. And it's the same with my photography and the book and everything else. I didn't think anybody was really interested, or I just assumed other people were doing something similar. And it never dawned on me that the way I'm articulating or thinking or navigating might be somewhat different than some others. I mean, clearly we all navigate in a different way, but I didn't realize maybe that mine was in some ways unique, because I just don't take myself that seriously, number one. And number two, it's just who I am. So it's interesting to get that. And it's the stories in the book. The book has 18 chapters, and each one starts with something related to the concept of inner harmony, living in balance, and one of the stepping stones to achieving that. And I didn't think it was of any interest, but then, well, the way the book started was I was approached by someone who worked on Ansel Adams books, and they found my work and they said, "You need to publish this work." So I ended up working with someone who published 14 of Ansel Adams' books. And he just started pulling all these stories out of me and said, "This has got to be part of the book, because this is not stuff that people normally think about. This is not a photography book. This is an immersive experience about life balance." So, that's how the book came about. Well, one of the reasons this has to do with not multitasking, but values and finding synergies. I had no intention of ever doing a book when these folks approached me. But a year or so before, the Dalai Lama, while we were sitting and holding hands, said, Dr. G calls me Dr. John, would you join me in promoting compassion worldwide? You can't say no to the Dalai Lama. So I said yes. So when the Ansel Adams folks knocked on my door, I said, well, maybe this is an opportunity to do what I've been talking about. So this concept of compassion and promoting compassion and self-care and inner harmony, life balance. So that's why I did the book. And all the museum exhibitions that we're doing, in the United States and overseas, one's called Shades of Compassion, the other's called A Sacred Path, all have to do with compassion. So again, it's using photography as a means of fostering physical and emotional health and sharing some of these concepts and the concept of compassion. Talking about compassion, there are different definitions of it, and I think it's really important for people to understand what I personally mean when I say compassion. The Webster's Dictionary talks about compassion toward those who are suffering. I can say from a medical perspective, without going into great detail, but viewing everything and everything around you and yourself as suffering and using that as motivation toward action is very unhealthy. Unless you have the toolkit, which almost none of us have, of how to process being exposed to all that trauma and stress that everyone else experiences, and knowing how to process it in a healthy way. So I view compassion as the intention to respond with kindness toward all who might benefit, not those who are suffering, all who might benefit, which is everyone who is somewhat out of balance, which we all are, out of a true motivation of care and concern for them, not what am I going to get out of it by being nice to them, not a reward system. So that's the way I look at compassion. And again, we don't have enough time to get into all the details, but the word of compassion or the concept of suffering is a mistranslation of dukkha, which was the Sanskrit for out of balance or out of alignment. So it's not suffering, even though that's the term that's used throughout the East and West. Its compassion is toward those who are out of balance, out of alignment. So it's not out of pity, it's out of a recognition of the reality of life and to try to get into better balance.
Yeah, I love that, just that definition that you touched on there, the intention to respond with kindness as a great definition of compassion, and the recognition that we are all out of balance, that we all experience that in some way, and compassion being that sense of unity, that we're kind of all in this ship together. We're all rowing this boat together, not just, an us versus them view of compassion or looking down on someone, feeling pity for them. I think that's a very healthy view. And honestly, Jon, there's so much more we could talk about. I try to keep these episodes close to, 40 minutes or so, maybe 45 minutes. And I think I would like to use just about everything that we talked about rather than like editing out any big piece. Because I think so much of this is valuable and useful for people to hear. Would love to ask you one question, though, that I always ask people at the end of these episodes. And that is, what is your dream right now?
So, first of all, I have no real expectations. I'm just here. Ideally, what I would love would be the opportunity to get in front of as many large audiences as possible, because I think we all can benefit from some of these concepts that I'm talking about, which are not original to me whatsoever, but are ones that I think I'm able to communicate in a way that most people can relate to. I'd love to get to the younger generation, college campuses, young professionals. I've spoken over 200 times to a wide range of audiences all around the world, 2,000 at a sitting, interfaith groups, medical groups, general public, college students, you name it. So I think that's the one thing that I would really love to have more opportunities to do, and also to speak with those who have influence at museums who might be interested in our two exhibitions that are related to compassion. One is that you had mentioned is drawing record crowds at the museum where it is right now, bringing in a diverse group that normally doesn't go to museums, and is based on the science of how we can really foster compassion and moving good intentions into effective action. So again, be more than happy to share information about those with any listeners that may be helpful in getting the attention of the right people for these exhibitions, which will be traveling for 5 to 10 years throughout the United States and overseas also.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. There's so much interesting work that you have done and that you are doing. I would recommend for anybody who's interested taking a look at your book, Inner Harmony, Living in Balance. For anyone who wants to learn more about your Shades of Compassion Foundation or your art exhibitions, would you like to share some details, some contact information or places where people can learn more about these things?
Well, thanks for asking. As far as the book is concerned, you can get it through any of your favorite booksellers in pretty much in the world. That being said, a more useful way potentially would be by going to our foundation's website, shadesofcompassion.org, or my personal website, kolkinphotography.com. And there's a link to the book. Both links will take you to the foundation's website where you can make a donation, a tax-deductible donation to the foundation. And as a thank you gift, you will get a signed and personalized copy or copies of the book. 100% of the money that we receive related to those donations go to two nonprofits, one that teaches to compassion for free to children worldwide, and the other that empowers disadvantaged women through micro grants. So that's the preferred way. Also, if you go to either of those websites, you can contact me and you can learn more about the foundation's work. You can, through the shadesofcompassion.org site, or from my photography through kolkinphotography.com. You can also contact me through either of those sites, and I'd be happy to share more information about anything that might be of interest.
Excellent. Excellent. I will include links to those sites in the show notes and the notes for this episode.
Thank you.
Well, Jon, thank you so much for sharing everything you shared in this episode today. I think it'll give people a lot of food for thought. So very, very grateful to have you here today.
My honor. A pleasure.
Along with this wonderful conversation with Jon, I've had some other fun and awesome things happening in my life recently. I recorded some wonderful podcast episodes with some great guests, and I'm really looking forward to sharing those with you all in the coming weeks. I started offering a free monthly online time management workshop called Task Time Energy, the workshop. If you're interested in seeing what that's all about and maybe joining us for one of those workshops, you can find more information on my website, scottmillercoaching.com. We'd love to have you join us for one of those workshops. We'd love to have you come on back again and listen to our next episode. Remember to like or subscribe or follow or whatever that button says on your podcast player. Leave a review for the podcast. I think people find those useful. And if you have any suggestions or ideas or thoughts that you want to share with me about the podcast, you can send me an email at scott@scottmillercoaching.com. Thanks for joining us. Take care.